Hi, I'm Fred McNeil, and thank you for watching QAC TV7. We've got Pete Abbott back, and Pete, we're just going to put you on the county payroll.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for coming back. Right now, we started when we first did this. Yes, when we first did this, I think you came in at about 75 degrees, and it was warm. Now here we are, November 23rd. It's a robust 45 maybe.
Blowing.
You were blown off the high seas, and I almost blown off my bike.
That's right.
How about, let's remind everybody, we've been doing the March, or Vietnam era tours with the United States Navy, and we've showed everybody, and let's do it again. Let's remind everybody, you retired a commander, UCLA graduate, okay, and we've taken us from minesweepers to destroyers, to all types of offshore bombing activities, command and control, that type of thing. So let's continue with the story. Yeah,
the box is kind of helpful in this respect.
I'm going to put it up gently.
We've sort of walked from the ensign bars up to the JGs, and then the lieutenant bars, and that's got the command at sea button in the middle, and that was my first command, the little minesweeper.
Okay.
And that's this ship here.
And by the way, I just want to interrupt you for a second. The back of this box is made in China.
Yes,
I think that's where the naval history is going to be written in the next 50 years.
Well, it could well be done.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the guys have got a lot of work ahead of them out in the South China Sea, but that's a different Navy and a different story
and another
a different
show.
era.
Another show, okay.
Yeah, so anyway, let's sort of start from I came home from the bad leg, the accident, lost the command, went back and was a chief of staff for a destroyer squadron, and we did a lot of interesting things in the early days in '66 and '67 when all of the big U.S. military buildup in Vietnam
OBJ and the country made a commitment. We're going to take a stand.
I told you we were kind of the bait to draw the PT boats out. The next thing was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The air raid started in earnest. We built up the South China Sea fleet to 200 ships on station around Vietnam, doing everything from reconnaissance and bombing off the carriers to shore bombardment and interdiction.
So this is war.
And support,
we were at war.
Support of amphibious operations and special operations and all kinds of crazy things going on. And I got back from that tour in '67, and the Navy sent me to England for 2 years plus, and I got loaned to the British Navy, had a great time, and came back and went to a very interesting job, which was to be the executive officer of a new construction destroyer that was built in Long Beach. Okay. So in '69, in November, we commissioned the Meyer Accord.
Vietnam War is still going on, right?
Yep.
Nixon
and one
had
of
just
our
become
neighbors
president,
up in Chestertown, Vice Admiral Jack Baldwin, retired, was my skipper on Meyer Accord. He lives in Chestertown now with his wife Leslie, and he went on to have a wonderful career, and I was really delighted. My executive officer tour was a very exciting time. But besides getting a new ship ready to go to war, we did go and deploy in 1971. Now, this was before the end of the war was in sight.
Okay, we're still negotiating in Paris, I believe, in '71. Fake negotiations. They were arguing over what type of table to have.
And the ground war and all was in a stalemate state. We really didn't have a commitment to go win this thing, and we were trying to find a way out of it.
Way to get out.
And the naval operations were, I'll say, sporadic in the sense that nobody knew which way this was going to go, but we still had 500,000 troops ashore.
Someone had to protect them.
Somebody had to be delivering this stuff to them. Somebody had to be keeping the bad guys out. So the interdiction, the blockade efforts, the air war was beginning to target more and more of the North Vietnamese movement inside the country. And our guys were getting more and more defensively positioned because the momentum of the war was beginning to shift. And so the Navy, I won't say we got more aggressive, but we got more focused. There was a little more sense of urgency about what we did.
You thought perhaps the clock was running out?
Yeah. And it permeated all the operations. Everybody was stressed. They were trying not to make more commitments and add more people, but the effort was necessary to accomplish what we were trying to do was greater, in the sense that the threat was bigger. That the other guys were beginning to look like they were winning.
Yeah. And the tide of American opinion
And the home
changed, right?
front, the whole thing at home was just so distressing to those of us who were in. And we kept going overseas and spending our 6 or 7 months and coming back to some home port in the United States and being confronted with the public sentiment on the decline. And that happened right on through. So in 71, I get back from this very interesting deployment in which we actually got to focus some of our time on the Cold War and the Soviet Union issues, because our last third of that deployment was spent in an exercise testing mode of the Soviet air defenses and Pacific Fleet readiness to deal with offensive U.S. operations in that area.
And this is off the coast of Vietnam? Or
no, this was way up
north.
Right up north in the winter time. Off,
off Russia.
Vladivostok and all that kind of stuff. So,
now, what was the thinking behind that?
Well, because we needed to develop some tactics and strategies and technologies to deal with a quick strike requirement.
With the thoughts the Russians would get involved?
No, without them knowing we were around, and being able to use a lot of deception and decoys and stuff. And it was a carrier-based operation with a whole squadron of destroyers, and we were part of the squadron.
Being shadowed by the Russians, or they didn't even?
I remember one time looking up, and there were 25 Russian airplanes around us, and
just saying hello and letting you know.
We were on picket station, and there were a half a dozen Soviet cruisers and destroyers with their weapons on the rails, radiating at us, and this was 1971. So, I mean, the real world.
So of the Vietnam down here,
geopolitical world. There you had Vietnam still cranking along, doing its stuff. It had been since '64,
right?
And now we're into
we switched gears, gone up off the Russian coast, and it was the height of the Cold War.
Yes, and here we are, really focused on the big war situation.
And most Americans probably pretty oblivious to it.
I mean, there's no recognition anywhere that all this stuff is going on. But the complexity of being a naval officer, a middle grade guy, executive officer on a destroyer, deployed, off the coast of Vietnam, Russia, 1 week, doing gunfire support for the Marines ashore. And then 2 weeks later, being up off the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Now, you probably answered my question. Geography. Vietnam down here, you would sail north.
Yeah, we went all the way up through into Japan and then north, above Japan.
Above Japan,
Yeah, so you're in Arctic waters almost. And this was a real flex of your tactical and
I've never heard of it. I think most Americans didn't even know that was going on, because
we
were so focused right on Vietnam.
Well, it was a deal that was a 1.5 year long exercise that we had been a part of before we left, and we were part of it while we were deployed. And this was a big Navy undertaking that probably didn't get much publicity, but it was pretty highly classified at the time. So anyhow, that we get back, and the Navy very kindly honored a request I had made since I entered the service, was that I could get my graduate education, which was one of the kind of guarantees that you had as a naval officer if you were a career guy, that if you didn't have an advanced degree, the Navy was probably going to find a way to
PhD,
give you something or an opportunity to get a specialization like an intel ticket, where you would be in the intelligence business on your non-sea duty type thing. So anyhow, I'd had lots of different orders to go to Monterey to go into various courses. Not language, but for various. The Intel program was one, and then there was another degree program. But I was never available to go because I was always going to a ship or going to the war. So finally, in 1971, the prayer was answered, and I got my orders to go to Harvard. And I got off the ship in Long Beach, and Dot and I had just gotten married, and we drove across the country, and our first duty station together was me going to school for 2 years at the Harvard Business School.
Harvard Square, that's not a bad deal, right?
Wonderful. Yeah. So
and what rank were you?
I was lieutenant commander.
Oh, lieutenant commander.
Just made lieutenant commander.
Okay, all right.
Which is next to the top. Yeah.
Okay.
I was an executive officer as a lieutenant commander and student for 2 years, And all of a sudden, I get orders at the end of my MBA program to go command an FFG.
Back to sea.
Yeah.
Okay.
In Long Beach.
Normal. I mean, it's a normal.
Normal rollover tour.
Okay.
2 years on my Accord as XO. 2 years in grad school. Right back to a 2-year command tour on a guided missile.
Hey, just a quick question. Back to the grad school. Would you, when school wasn't in session, would you go on active duty? Oh no, full-time student. How did it work? I mean, how did they do that?
My duties in the summer were to do an internship with one of the professors at the business
so
school.
you're basically
And
a full-time student.
Professor Bob Hayes was kind enough to take me. I was an operations guy, and he was on the faculty of the business school and in the operations department. The dean of that department, the head of it, was a guy named Wick Skinner, very well-known educator, and Bob Hayes has kind of taken his role in the next generation. But Bob sent me to England to do an interview and fact-finding tour of English electronics manufacturing facilities as part of a graduate study that was being done by the department on international modernization and improvements of manufacturing capabilities in the electronics world, where we were now in the 70s and digitization.
Things were just beginning to flip,
chips were coming in and this kind of stuff. So it was a really good summer. I got to spend my time there and came back.
So you were with the Brits studying their system.
Yeah, and I wrote up a big,
paper or something.
Report of my findings, and some of this stuff ended up in the case clearinghouse study program, so it could be written into case studies as kind of realism about what was going on in these international manufacturing things. So
how this could help the Navy in the long term?
That's a hidden part of my life, is that my education has really been in industrial engineering and production management, how to get things done and built. And I've always been fascinated by how things were made and manufactured and materials sciences.
You kind of specialized that during your MBA?
Yeah, my thesis was the technological evolution of the oil tanker.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, moving petroleum over the ocean, and it came to this. But that doesn't
and
have
all
a lot.
the technical changes in terms of equipment being used, the ship itself, etc.
Yeah, so here's where the linkage really pays off. I get my orders to go to Ramsey, and she's in the shipyard in Long Beach sitting at pier. We have the change of command ceremony, and I think it was around August of '73. And that afternoon, the tugboats came because the ship was somewhat dissembled at that time. It had already been started to get ready for the overhaul, moving into the shipyard. And the tugs moved us into the dry dock, and this is the ship in the dry dock.
Okay,
and
I'll show that to the camera.
I spent my first 7.5 months in command of the ship in that
in the dry dock, right there. Okay. Now, is the crew assembled or no?
The crew was she was a commissioned ship in service, had been built and put in service in '69. So this is not a ship that is an old ship. It's been through a couple of captains, and I'm the third guy as a skipper. And she's due for this major year-long overhaul, and there's $100 million worth of work to be done. And at the time, the Navy now, 1973,
so it's still fighting a war.
But the decision to kind of
slow down a bit,
ended at the highest levels has been made. So you get all of the drawdown functions going on, people, logistics support, ordering new parts, and
everything has been slowed down from the top.
Coming. You have to kind of look at the whole balloon as having the air slowly start to come out of it. During the year that we spent in the shipyard trying to get the ship undone, repaired, modernized, rebuilt, retrained, and going back to sea again, this was a ship with 19 officers and 230 enlisted men. We went through 750 enlisted people in the crew during that year, Now, if you can imagine the turbulence and turnover
yeah.
of taking 230 guys in
turning it over
specific
3
jobs,
times, right? Yeah.
and 3 times turnover, and nobody going to be there at the end of the year, so they don't really care too much about how things go. But you know, I know that we got to have a combat-ready ship ready to go to sea, leave almost the day that they say we're ready, and go back and do another 7 to 8 months.
Now, what did the
deployment?
What did the enlisted folks do? Were they training?
No,
they
get chipping hammers in their hand, and they're laying
put them to work.
linoleum, or they're painting, or
so they're actually
working on their gear, and the electronics folks are over in the shops working on their radars and radios. And
so you're either working in a shop or working on the boat itself while it's on dry dock.
Right.
Okay.
So the 19 officers, who are the executive team, essentially, the planners, the schedulers, the overseers, the allocators of work, and organizers of people, and people who are supposed to be responsible for training your enlisted to get them ready for exams, to get promoted, and teaching them about going back to sea and becoming sailors, and you're sitting in a dry dock with no water ready. That gets a little hairy. That's when my hair turned white and a couple other things in my life, but we managed to get it done.
And if I also remember, you correct me if I'm wrong, that was also when there was a lot of upheaval in the Navy. Was there not racial problems and identification?
You had the Zumwalt Revolution.
The Z-Man was there, right?
The Z-Man was there. So you had an enlisted corps who were never sure how many more privileges they were going to get in the next morning's
That's when they let them start in beard changes,
civilian
different clothes
on board, no more Liberty cards, you couldn't control the people's movements, and all this kind of stuff.
It was like a little revolution going on, not only in the country,
at the same
but
time, you had a nationwide, global racial tension thing building up, which resulted in some very serious problems in the Navy and race riots on some of the big ships. This undertone
it's a difficult time for everybody,
drove the Navy to some very different ways of approaching training, behavioral training, sensitivity training, racial awareness, all this kind of stuff, and you began to get a flavor of what personnel management was going to be like after the. And
like you say, the war is winding down. The public had basically, they said no more. Right, even though Nixon won by a landslide in '72, there was a lot of dissent.
So in January of '75, we have gone from late August of '73 through a year, 13 months in the shipyard. Now we're in September of '74 when they finally certify us as ready to go back to sea. And we have only until January of '75 to work up a whole crew, get it trained, get it certified, go through a fleet training group, go through missile ops, go through all of the battle, condition training.
Get to a duty station.
And get ready to go deploy to the Far East, to commit to be combat ready for your deployment. So we end up doing that, and we left on about, I think it was January 5th of '75, and we left San Diego. At that point, we had moved from Long Beach as our home port, out of the shipyard, moved the whole team to San Diego, all the families, had 3 months there, and essentially then left. Well, we lit the boilers off and got underway. This is January the 5th. And we didn't turn the boilers off until May sometime. We ran 156 days without 2 boiler ship, 1 screw, 1 motor, and we ran that ship for 156 days nonstop.
And doing what now?
We did everything you can imagine.
Off of Vietnam,
right to Vietnam. We did shore bombardment for military units, both American and South Vietnamese, who were getting overrun by North Vietnamese.
Well, I was going to say, 75. Now you got to help me here. Strategic withdrawal, were we not leaving?
We were in crisis withdrawal. The North Vietnamese essentially had been told that they had a free run to go down Route 1 and take the coast. And all down the coast, every place that there was a port, there were thousands and hundreds of thousands of refugee South Vietnamese people wanted to get out, and we were escorting merchant ships into those ports and guarding them while they were loading
Get 'em
10,
out.
15,
Okay.
18,000 South Vietnamese on board, and then getting them either to the Philippines, where the first huge refugee center was set up, and my ship had a very important role in that. We were the only guys in Subic when the word came down to set up the rec center at Grandy Island in the middle
So a
of
place
Subic
where the
Harbor.
refugees could come.
My crew built all the facilities for the
Yeah.
first group of refugees, and before it was over, there were like 400,000 there.
In
And
the
then,
Philippines?
yeah, and then they had to do it in Guam, and that was 1,200 miles west, and all those merchant ships had to be escorted. So we were running a destroyer with 2 or 3 merchant ships to Guam.
Getting
to off
people,
them-
taking them back. Getting people, taking them back.
Yeah, right.
And meanwhile, the country's falling apart.
Exactly, and every time we'd get back, there'd be another crisis
Another spot.
order. One time, with the radio sent us a note, and my Commodore said, "Hey, we just got a task, and you are it. Go out and gather up 10 Cambodian naval ships that have fled their headquarters." They fled because they were getting run over by the North Vietnamese. Cambodia was getting
So these were people. Okay.
They had been on the South Vietnamese side of the war,
Okay.
and so they packed up their families
And just left.
and got on these little ships. I mean, they're not big, 150, 180 foot kind of coastal stuff, and they're all out in the middle of the South China Sea floundering around.
Not knowing where to go or what to do.
Of my 19 officers, at one point, 10 of them were in command of Cambodian naval ships
To get them
trailing
to a port.
behind my destroyer on our way back to Subic Bay like a mother chicken with her little
Now,
chicks.
help me. What's again with the geography? What's a trip from coast of Vietnam to Philippines?
We actually had to go around the south end of Vietnam because Cambodia the Cambodian coast was up inside the
Yes. Okay. So
sea
you came down. Okay.
So we came down. I would say it's probably 400, 500 miles or so.
So
400 miles.
help me with by ship. How long?
I think that whole that project took over a week to gather those guys up and get them back to Subic and herd them in together and get them tied up and anchored up and get them into the refugee status program. And then we were off to do something else. And the other exciting one that came along very shortly after the Cambodian thing, the Henry B. Wilson, which is the ship that we sailed across the ocean together.
Right.
Ramsey and Wilson deployed from San Diego as a 2-destroyer unit deploying, one of the most unusual things, but it was all because of the engineering examinations we all had to go through and get passed and everything finally, and they'd gone through the overhaul with us. So Mike Rogers, who was a skipper, and we got told we're going to be a task element to sail across the ocean together. We checked the book, and I was 1 number senior to Mike. So I got the task element job, and we made an agreement, handshake at the bar before we left. They said, no radios. We're going by light and signal flags the whole way across the ocean. And we did it. It was great.
Well, look as usual, we're out of time.
Oh, no.
But that's all right. We'll get a cup of coffee. We'll come back. As long as you...
Fred, we spent the last couple of days in Saigon Harbor watching the helicopters fall out of the sky. The final deal before we came home, and that was the end of it for me. I started in 64, ended it in 75, came back, got relieved, went to the Naval Academy, spent 3.5 years and retired.
Okay, well maybe if we have time, it might be interesting to talk about the evacuation of Saigon. We'll see if you feel like coming back. But look, Pete, thank you again, okay?
My pleasure.
It's the quickest half an hour in your life, isn't it?
It is. I can't believe it.
Fred McNeil, you've been watching Veteran Stories with Pete Abbott. If we can, I'll try to bribe him with a cup of coffee, because I know I was actually living in Australia when that evacuation, and maybe we'll continue with our Vietnam War stories, talking about the evacuation of Saigon. Again, Pete, thank you, and thank you for watching QAC TV 7.